They're trying to take my ranch.
The old man's voice trembled through the phone before the line suddenly went dead. 200 miles away, Joseph Wilson froze beside his patrol car. He had not heard from Thomas More in years, but he recognized the fear in that broken whisper. Before sunrise, Joseph was driving through the frozen Idaho countryside with his German Shepherd Ranger beside him. When they reached Moore Ridge, Thomas was lying in a hospital bed with broken ribs, while his own son was already preparing papers to declare him mentally unfit. But the darkest secret was waiting back at the ranch. The moment Ranger approached an old locked barn, he stopped, raised his ears, and began growling at something hidden behind the wooden wall. Joseph was no ordinary visitor. Decades earlier, Thomas had paid his police academy tuition and given a poor young man a future. Now that young man had come home to repay the debt. What Ranger uncovered would expose a family betrayal, save an old man's legacy, and change several lives forever. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the story. Late January had settled over Willow Creek, Idaho, with frozen fields, dark mountain roads, and a steady wind sweeping snow against the windows of the county hospital. Thomas More woke to the quiet beeping of a heart monitor and a deep ache along the left side of his chest. For several seconds he could not remember where he was. The ceiling above him was white, the blanket was too thin, and the air carried the clean, sharp smell of disinfectant. Then he tried to move. Pain spread beneath his ribs and forced the breath from his lungs. Thomas was 79 years old, a widowed ranch owner who had spent most of his life managing Moore Ridge, a working horse and cattle ranch outside Willow Creek. He had survived winter storms, broken fences, sick livestock, and nearly 5 decades of early mornings. He knew the ordinary complaints of an aging body. This pain was different. A nurse had already explained that 2 ribs were cracked. The fall had happened at the staircase inside his farmhouse. According to everyone around him, he had lost his balance. Thomas remembered reaching the top step. He remembered the hallway light behind him. He remembered hearing someone move near the staircase. After that, there was only a brief sensation of weightlessness, followed by the wooden steps striking his back and side. The door opened, and Derek Moore entered with a paper cup of coffee in one hand. Derek was 46, Thomas's only son, and a real estate investor who had spent most of the past decade working in Boise. He wore a calm expression that seemed carefully prepared before he entered the room. "You're awake," Derek said. "How are you feeling?" "Like I fell down a staircase." Derek smiled, though the warmth did not reach his eyes. "The doctor said you were lucky." Thomas studied him. "Lucky would have been staying on my feet." Before Derek could answer, Dr. Samuel Harris stepped into the room. He was a 58-year-old physician who had worked at Willow Creek County Hospital for nearly 20 years. He carried a tablet beneath one arm and spoke in the patient-measured tone of a man accustomed to delivering difficult information. "Good morning, Mr. Moore. I'd like to ask you a few questions before we discuss your discharge plan." Thomas nodded. Dr. Harris glanced at the tablet. "Do you remember what happened yesterday?" "He fell," Derek answered quickly. "He's been having trouble with balance." Thomas turned his head toward his son. Dr. Harris looked at Derek, then back at Thomas. "I'd like to hear from your father." Derek raised both hands slightly. "Of course. I'm only trying to help." Thomas described what he remembered, leaving out the movement near the stairs. He was not yet certain what it meant, and he had learned long ago not to accuse anyone before he understood the ground beneath his feet. Dr. Harris asked him the date, the name of the town, and the current president. Thomas answered each question clearly. Derek shifted near the window. "He has good days," Derek said, "but lately he forgets appointments. He leaves things in strange places. Last month he couldn't remember where he put the ranch account book." "I found it in your truck," Thomas replied. Derek's expression tightened for only a moment. "That's exactly the kind of confusion I mean." Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the winter outside. The door opened again, and Melissa Moore entered carrying a leather folder. Melissa was 43, Derek's wife, and she handled the financial records for his property business. She was known in Willow Creek for her polished manners and her ability to speak as though every decision had already been made. "I brought the care documents," she said. Thomas looked at the folder. "What care documents?" "Nothing alarming," Melissa replied. "Just forms that will make things easier while you recover. Medical access, temporary authority, help with bills." She placed the folder on the table beside his bed and opened it to a page marked with a yellow tab. "You only need to sign in a few places." Thomas did not reach for the pen. Dr. Harris closed his tablet. "Mr. Moore should review any legal documents when he is rested and free from pain medication." Melissa smiled politely. "Naturally." Derek looked toward the doctor. "We're concerned about him living alone. The ranch is too much for someone his age." Thomas felt the words land harder than they should have. Moore Ridge was not simply land. It was the place where he had built a life with his late wife, Margaret. It held the barn they had repaired during their first winter, the pasture where Derek had learned to ride, and the cottonwood tree beneath which Margaret's ashes had been scattered. "I still manage the ranch," Thomas said. "You try to," Derek replied softly. The room fell silent. Dr. Harris excused himself after promising to return later. Melissa closed the folder but left it within Thomas's reach. She and Derek spent the afternoon discussing rehabilitation schedules, home safety equipment, and possible changes to the ranch. They spoke around Thomas as though he were already absent. By evening, the hospital corridor had grown quiet. Snow tapped against the dark window. Thomas lay awake, listening to Derek and Melissa speak in low voices near the door. They believed he was sleeping. "We're running out of time," Melissa whispered. "The company will wait until the end of the month," Derek answered. "Not without control of the property." Thomas kept his breathing slow. "I'll get his signature," Derek said. "Once the power of attorney is filed, we can complete the sale." "And if he refuses?" A pause followed. "He won't. He's hurt, he's frightened, and everyone already believes he shouldn't be alone." Thomas stared into the darkness. Derek continued. "Moore Ridge will be sold before the month ends. The resort company has already approved the numbers." Their footsteps faded down the corridor. For a long time, Thomas did not move. The fall returned to him in broken pieces. His foot had reached the first step. A hand had touched the back of his shoulder. Not hard. Only enough to disturb the balance of an old man standing near a staircase. He could not prove it. He could not even be certain. But, for the first time in his life, Thomas Moore was afraid of his own son. His fingers moved toward the chair beside the bed. Beneath his folded coat was an old prepaid phone that Derek did not know existed. Thomas had purchased it months earlier after several calls from old friends mysteriously failed to reach him. He switched it on and searched through the few saved numbers. Joseph Wilson's name appeared on the screen. Joseph was 42, a police officer serving in a town more than 200 miles away. Decades earlier, he had been a quiet teenager from a struggling family who worked weekends repairing fences at Moore Ridge. When Joseph earned a place at the police academy but could not afford the tuition, Thomas had paid the bill without asking for repayment. Thomas had never considered it a debt. Tonight, it felt like the only bridge still standing. The phone rang twice. "Wilson," a steady voice answered. Thomas closed his eyes. He could have explained the fall. He could have told Joseph about the documents, the sale, and the conversation in the hallway. But he did not know who might enter the room, and he did not know whether the hospital phone lines were being watched. So he used a sentence that belonged to an old promise. "Your first badge is still in my drawer." Silence filled the line. Years earlier, Joseph had told Thomas that if he ever spoke those words, it would mean he needed help and could not safely explain why. 200 miles away, Joseph stood in the kitchen of his small home. Ranger, his 7-year-old German shepherd, lay near the back door with his head resting on his paws. Ranger had worked beside Joseph during searches, missing person cases, and long nights when instinct mattered more than certainty. The moment Joseph's posture changed, Ranger lifted his head. Joseph's voice became lower. "Are you alone?" "For the moment." "Are you safe?" "I don't know." Joseph looked toward the dark window, then at Ranger. "I'm coming home." Thomas released a breath he had not realized he was holding. The call ended less than a minute later. At that same hour, 15 miles outside town, Noah Pierce crossed the snowy yard of Moore Ridge carrying 2 buckets of feed. Noah was 16, a high school student who lived with his grandmother and worked part-time at the ranch to help with household expenses. Thomas had asked him to care for the horses while he was in the hospital. As Noah approached the northern barn, he stopped. A new steel lock hung from the door. Thomas never locked that barn. Before Noah could examine it, an engine started behind the building. A dark pickup truck pulled onto the service road and sped toward the highway. Noah tried to read the license plate, but snow covered the rear bumper. He stood alone beside the locked barn, listening as the truck disappeared into the winter night. Inside the hospital, Thomas placed the phone beneath his coat and looked toward the door. Nothing around him had changed. The papers still waited on the table. His ribs still hurt. His son still believed the ranch was almost his. But somewhere beyond the mountains, Joseph Wilson was already reaching for his keys. And, for the first time since the fall, Thomas no longer felt entirely alone. Joseph Wilson reached Willow Creek County Hospital shortly after sunrise. The storm had weakened during the night, but thin ribbons of snow still crossed the highway as he pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. Ranger remained in the truck, alert behind the passenger window, while Joseph entered through the emergency wing and followed the signs toward the second floor. Derek was waiting outside Thomas's room. The moment he saw Joseph, he stepped forward with a surprised smile and offered his hand. "Joseph Wilson, I heard you were coming." Joseph accepted the handshake. "Thomas called me." "I figured he might." Derek lowered his voice as though sharing a private concern. "He's been reaching out to people at odd hours lately. The doctor thinks the fall may have confused him more than we first realized." Joseph looked through the narrow glass panel in the door. Thomas was awake, sitting against raised pillows while Melissa arranged several documents on the bedside table. "How confused?" Joseph asked. Derek sighed. "He forgets conversations, misplaces important things. Sometimes he becomes suspicious over nothing. Yesterday, he insisted someone had moved the ranch account book, even though it was exactly where he left it." Joseph said nothing. He remembered Thomas correcting Derek about that same account book during the doctor's visit. The old man had said it had been found in Derek's truck. Derek continued speaking as they entered the room. He explained Thomas's medication schedule, the doctor's concerns, and the changes that might be necessary at Moore Ridge. He spoke with the practiced patience of a devoted son, but Joseph noticed that nearly every sentence led to the same conclusion. Thomas could no longer be trusted to make decisions alone. Thomas turned toward Joseph, and the tension around his eyes softened. "You made good time," he said. "I started driving after your call." Melissa smiled as though the visit pleased her. "That was kind of you. Thomas has been emotional since the accident." "I'm sitting right here," Thomas said. "Of course you are," she replied gently. The softness of her tone disturbed Joseph more than anger would have. It reduced Thomas's protest to the harmless complaint of an old man who did not understand what was best for him. Dr. Harris entered several minutes later to check Thomas's condition. He asked whether the pain had improved and whether Thomas felt strong enough to walk with assistance. "It's better than yesterday," Thomas answered. "He barely slept," Derek said at the same time, "and he was confused during the night." Thomas looked at him. "I was awake because my ribs hurt." Derek gave the doctor a weary expression. "This is what I mean. He doesn't remember the nurse checking on him twice." "I remember both visits," Thomas replied. "The second nurse brought warm water because the first cup had gone cold." Dr. Harris glanced between them before continuing the examination. Joseph watched carefully. Thomas answered every medical question without hesitation. He remembered the date of the fall, the medication he had been given, and the instructions from the night nurse. He did not sound confused. He sounded irritated. That difference mattered. When Dr. Harris asked Thomas whether he felt safe returning home, Derek answered before his father could speak. No, absolutely not. Thomas's jaw tightened. Dr. Harris turned to him. Mr. Moore? I want to return to my ranch. Derek stepped closer to the bed. Dad, you fell down your own stairs. I know where I fell. You could have died. That doesn't give you the right to make every decision for me. Melissa placed a hand on Derek's arm. No one is trying to take away your choices, Thomas. We are trying to protect you. Joseph looked at the folder beside the bed. What are those papers? Temporary care arrangements, Melissa said. Medical access, financial assistance, things the family needs while he recovers. Have they been reviewed by his attorney? The question changed the room. Melissa's smile remained, but her fingers stopped moving over the folder. Derek looked at Joseph for a moment before answering. We're family. We don't need to involve attorneys in every small decision. Documents concerning financial authority are not small decisions. Derek's friendly expression cooled slightly. You've been here 10 minutes. And Thomas asked me to come. Silence settled between them. Dr. Harris finished the examination and said Thomas would likely be released the following day if his condition remained stable. Derek immediately began asking about home supervision and whether a medical recommendation could prevent Thomas from returning to Moore Ridge. The doctor answered carefully. Thomas would need help with meals, transportation, and physical tasks for several weeks, but nothing in the examination suggested he lacked the mental ability to make personal decisions. Joseph saw relief pass through Thomas's face. Derek did not react. A few minutes later, Melissa reminded him of an appointment downstairs with the hospital's discharge coordinator. They left together, taking the folder with them. The room felt larger the moment the door closed. Thomas leaned back against the pillows and released a slow breath. They never stopped talking long enough for anyone to hear me. Joseph pulled a chair closer. Tell me when it started. At first, it looked like kindness. After Margaret's death, Derek had offered to help with the bills. Thomas had accepted because the paperwork had become harder to face in the quiet house. A few months later, Melissa began organizing the bank statements. Then, Derek asked for access to the ranch accounts so he could make payments during winter storms. By the time I realized what was happening, Thomas said, every road in my life seemed to pass through them. Calls from old friends began disappearing. Messages were never delivered. Invitations stopped arriving. Derek said people were trying to avoid upsetting Thomas after Margaret's death. Thomas later learned that at least 2 friends had called several times. Derek had told them Thomas was too tired to speak. He kept my regular phone last week, Thomas continued, said the battery was damaged. I haven't seen it since. Joseph's expression hardened. What about the guardianship papers? Thomas looked toward the door before answering. I heard Melissa mention them during a call. She said they needed another medical opinion before filing. When I asked, she claimed I had misunderstood. Have you seen the documents? Only part of one page. It said I was showing signs of impaired judgment. Joseph thought of Thomas's clear answers during the medical examination. Do you know who prepared it? No. The door opened before Joseph could ask more. A woman in pale blue scrubs entered carrying a tray of medication. Helen Moore was 64, a senior nurse who had worked at Willow Creek County Hospital for more than 35 years. Her calm voice and direct manner had earned the trust of several generations of local families. She checked Thomas's identification bracelet, handed him the medication, and waited until he had taken it. Her eyes moved briefly toward the closed door. You're Joseph Wilson? She asked. Yes. Helen nodded slowly. I remember you from years ago. Thomas used to mention the young man studying at the police academy. Thomas almost smiled. He made it through. I can see that. She adjusted the blanket near Thomas's injured side, then asked if he needed anything else. Thomas requested fresh water, and Helen left the room. 10 minutes later, Joseph stepped into the corridor to make a call. Helen stood near the nurse's station, writing notes on a chart. When she saw him, she closed the folder and walked toward a quiet alcove near the stairwell. "You care about him?" she asked. "Yes." "Then pay attention." Joseph waited. This is his third hospital visit in less than a year. He had known about the recent fall, but not the others. Helen explained that Thomas had been treated 8 months earlier for a badly bruised shoulder. Derek said a horse had knocked him against a stall. 4 months later, Thomas arrived with a sprained wrist and a cut near his temple. Melissa said he had tripped over a loose rug. "Did Thomas confirm those stories?" Joseph asked. "He repeated them," Helen said. "That is not always the same thing." Joseph understood what she meant. "Were there any reports?" "Nothing that proved abuse. No clear statement from Thomas. No witness. The injuries were possible under the explanations they gave." "But you didn't believe them." Helen looked toward Thomas's room. "I believed he was becoming quieter every time he came here." That answer stayed with Joseph. Across town, Clara Bennett was working alone in the basement of Willow Creek Public Library. Clara was 68, the library's longtime director and one of Margaret Moore's closest friends. She had spent the morning sorting boxes of donated books before the building opened. One carton carried Margaret's name in faded ink. The books had remained in storage since her death because Clara had never found the heart to examine them closely. That morning, she lifted an old collection of ranch journals and felt something shift inside the cover. A sealed envelope slipped onto the table. Clara recognized Margaret's handwriting at once. Her hands became still as she read the words written across the front. "Open only if Moore Ridge is in danger." For several seconds, Clara simply stared at the envelope. Then she reached for the telephone. Back at the hospital, Joseph returned to Thomas's room and found Derek holding the old man's coat. "I'm taking this home," Derek said. "He won't need it until discharge." Thomas's eyes moved toward the pocket where the prepaid phone had been hidden. Joseph stepped forward and took the coat from Derek's hands. "I'll keep it here." Derek looked at him. "Why?" "Because Thomas asked me to help." No one spoke after that. Joseph hung the coat inside the bedside cabinet and closed the door. It was a small act, almost meaningless to anyone watching from the hallway. To Thomas, it felt like the first unlocked door in a very long time. Thomas returned to Moore Ridge late the next afternoon, when pale winter sunlight was already fading behind the Idaho hills. Joseph drove slowly along the snow-covered road, careful to avoid the deeper drifts near the ranch gate. Ranger sat upright in the back seat, watching the familiar fields with steady attention. Derek had argued against the discharge from the moment Dr. Harris approved it. He insisted Thomas should be moved to a rehabilitation center, or at least brought to his house in Boise. Melissa supported him with quiet remarks about safety, medication, and the dangers of an old man living on an isolated ranch. Thomas refused both suggestions. "I am going home," he said. Joseph had arranged for temporary help with meals and physical chores. He would remain at the ranch while Thomas recovered, and Noah would continue caring for the horses. Doctor. Harris had found no medical reason to prevent the decision. Derek stood beside the hospital entrance as Joseph helped Thomas into the truck. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Thomas paused before lowering himself into the seat. "No, I'm making my own decision." Derek looked at Joseph. "If something happens to him, this is on you." Joseph closed the passenger door gently. "Thomas knows where he wants to be." The drive to Moore Ridge took less than an hour. Thomas said little along the way. He watched the white fields pass outside the window as though checking that each fence, tree, and distant ridge remained where he had left it. When the farmhouse appeared beyond the last curve, some of the strain left his face. Ranger became alert before the truck stopped. The German Shepherd lifted his head, turned toward the northern side of the property, and drew in several slow breaths through his nose. The old barn stood beyond the horse paddock, partly hidden behind a row of cottonwood trees. Joseph opened the rear door. Ranger jumped down, but instead of following Thomas toward the house, he remained beside the truck with his body angled toward the barn. "What does he see?" Thomas asked. "Maybe nothing yet." Ranger moved several steps forward. His nose tested the wind. A faint growl sounded in his throat, low and controlled. Joseph followed his gaze. The northern barn had once stored tack, tools, and winter feed. Thomas rarely used it now except for old equipment. From the farmhouse, nothing appeared unusual. Then Joseph noticed the new lock. Noah had mentioned it during a short telephone call that morning. Seeing it in place made the detail feel more serious. The steel was bright and clean against the weathered wooden door. "Did you put that there?" Joseph asked. Thomas narrowed his eyes. "No. Does Derek have a key? He has keys to the main buildings, not to that lock." Ranger moved closer but stopped when Joseph called him back. Evening was approaching, Thomas was tired, and the snow around the barn had already been disturbed by wind. Joseph decided to wait until daylight. Inside the farmhouse, he helped Thomas settle into the downstairs bedroom. Margaret had once used the room for guests, and Thomas disliked sleeping there because it made him feel like a visitor in his own home. Still, the staircase was too dangerous while his ribs healed. Noah arrived before sunset carrying groceries and a bag of horse feed. He appeared relieved to see Thomas home, but his attention repeatedly shifted toward the northern windows. "You saw the truck leave from behind the barn?" Joseph asked. Noah nodded. It was dark, maybe black or blue. A large pickup. "How many people were inside?" "I only saw the driver." "Did you recognize him?" "No." Joseph noticed that Noah answered too quickly, but he did not press him. Fear often closed a person faster than silence did. That night, Ranger slept near the kitchen door. Twice, Joseph heard him rise and move to the window facing the barn. Each time, the dog stood quietly for several minutes before returning to the floor. Before sunrise, Joseph woke to the sound of Ranger's nails crossing the wooden boards. The dog waited by the back door. Joseph dressed, took a flashlight, and stepped outside with him. The air was still and bitterly cold. Fresh frost covered the fence rails while the eastern sky carried the first faint line of gray. Ranger walked directly toward the northern barn. He did not wander or circle the yard. He followed one purpose. At the edge of the paddock, Joseph found the first set of footprints. They were deep, wide, and too large to belong to Noah. A second set crossed beside them. Both trails led around the barn instead of toward the front entrance. Joseph crouched to examine the ground. The tracks were recent. A thin crust of frost had formed over the edges, but the deeper impressions remained sharp. Nearby, heavy tire marks cut through the frozen soil beneath the snow. The distance between the tracks suggested a large truck carrying significant weight. Ranger continued along the rear wall. His nose moved close to the wooden boards. He paused at one section and began breathing more quickly. Joseph caught the smell a moment later. Machine oil. Beneath it was the colder scent of metal and disturbed earth. Several boards looked older than the rest, but the nails were new. Scratches surrounded the edges, and one corner had been forced back into place with a hammer. Joseph returned to the farmhouse for tools. Thomas was awake when he entered the kitchen. "You found something?" "Someone opened part of the rear wall recently." Thomas lowered himself carefully into a chair. "That barn hasn't needed repairs in years." "Stay inside. With?" "Noah, until I know what is there." Thomas gave him a dry look. "I'm injured, Joseph. Not obedient. You can be both for one morning." For the first time since leaving the hospital, Thomas almost laughed. Joseph returned to the barn with a pry bar and a small camera. He photographed the wall, the prints, and the tire tracks before touching anything. Then he removed the newer nails one at a time. Behind the boards was a narrow compartment built between the wall and an old storage room. Several cardboard boxes had been placed inside. The first contained business records. Joseph carried it into the open barn and examined the papers beneath the growing morning light. Bank notices, loan agreements, missed payment warnings. Derek's name appeared on nearly every page. The debts were far larger than Thomas had imagined. Failed housing developments, private loans, unpaid contractor fees, and high-interest financing stretched back more than 3 years. Some notices warned of legal action. Others demanded payment within weeks. The second box held plans for Moore Ridge. There were maps of the ranch marked with proposed roads, cabins, parking areas, and a hotel overlooking the western pasture. A company called Summit Crown Resorts appeared throughout the documents. One draft contract listed Thomas as the property owner. A signature line waited beneath his name. Joseph found handwritten notes in the margin calculating how much money would remain after Derek's debts were paid. Almost nothing. The final folder made him stop. It contained medical evaluations of Thomas. At first, the forms appeared official. The language described memory loss, confusion, poor judgment, and increasing dependence on family members. Several pages recommended that a guardian be appointed to manage Thomas's legal and financial affairs. Joseph read them twice. Then he noticed the differences in ink. Dates had been overwritten. Sentences had been added between typed lines. A physician's note stating that Thomas remained alert and capable had been partly covered by a copied paragraph describing cognitive decline. These were not simple misunderstandings. Someone had changed the records. Ranger moved beside the open compartment and gave a quiet warning sound. Joseph turned. Noah stood near the barn entrance. His face had lost its color. "You knew something was here," Joseph said. Noah looked at the documents, then at the floor. "I didn't know what." "What did you see?" For several seconds, Noah remained silent. He rubbed his hands together, though he was wearing gloves. "A few weeks ago, I came early to fix the water line. Melissa was inside the barn with a man." "What man?" "He wore a dark suit. He had a silver car parked behind the trees." "Did you hear them talking?" "Only part of it. She said Thomas would sign once the doctor's papers were ready." Joseph kept his voice calm. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Noah's eyes filled with shame. "The man saw me. Later, Melissa said people who cause trouble at Moore Ridge could lose more than a job. My grandmother depends on what I earn here." Joseph understood. Noah was 16, carrying responsibilities that would have frightened many adults. "You do not have to make a statement today," Joseph said. Noah looked up. "But this matters." "It does." "What if they come after my grandmother?" "Then we protect both of you before asking you to speak." Noah swallowed. "Does being afraid make me a coward?" "No." Joseph glanced toward the farmhouse where Thomas stood behind the kitchen window watching the barn. "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is choosing what is right while fear is still standing beside you." Noah looked toward the boxes. "I'll tell you everything," he said. "Just not yet." Joseph nodded. "That is enough for now." By mid-morning, the evidence had been photographed and moved to a secure room inside the farmhouse. Thomas sat at the dining table while Joseph explained the debts, the resort contract, and the altered medical reports. The old man listened without interrupting. When Joseph finished, Thomas looked toward a framed photograph of Derek as a boy sitting on a fence with his first riding boots. "He needed money," Thomas said quietly. "He needed control," Joseph replied. Thomas closed his eyes. Outside, Ranger returned to the barn and stood beside the opened wall, facing the dark compartment as if he knew it had revealed only the first layer of the truth. Clara Bennett arrived at Moore Ridge shortly before noon, carrying a brown envelope inside a canvas book bag. The winter sky had cleared, but the cold remained sharp enough to freeze the edges of the horse troughs. Joseph saw her car from the kitchen window and stepped outside before she reached the porch. Clara held the bag close to her chest. "I found something that belongs here." Thomas was seated at the dining table when she entered. His face changed the moment he saw the handwriting on the envelope. For several seconds, he did not speak. "That is Margaret's writing," he said at last. Clara nodded. "I found it inside one of the books she donated to the library. It was hidden beneath the inner cover." She placed the envelope on the table. Across the front, in Margaret's careful handwriting, were the words, Open only if Moore Ridge is in danger. Thomas rested his fingertips against the paper but did not open it immediately. Margaret had been gone for 6 years, yet the shape of her letters made the room feel briefly occupied by her presence. "She always planned 3 steps ahead," he said. "She also knew when you would refuse to see trouble," Clara replied. Thomas gave her a tired look. "You sound like her. That was often the price of being her friend." The faint humor faded as Thomas opened the envelope. Inside were 4 folded pages and a smaller sheet bearing the name of a law office in Boise. Joseph remained near the window while Clara sat across from Thomas. Ranger lay beside the stove, but his ears lifted when the paper began to unfold. Thomas read the first paragraph silently. His expression tightened. Joseph waited until the old man looked up. "Do you want me to read it?" Thomas shook his head. "I need to." Margaret's letter had been written 7 years earlier during the final months of her illness. She began by explaining that she had hidden the message because she feared Thomas would destroy it if she placed it directly in his hands. Clara gave a quiet sigh. "She knew you well." Thomas continued reading. Years earlier, Derek had taken money from a family business account without permission. At the time, Moore Ridge operated a small equipment company that repaired trailers, pumps, and farm machinery for neighboring ranches. Derek had used part of the company's reserve fund to invest in a private development project near Boise. The investment failed within months. Contractors demanded payment. A lender threatened legal action. Derek faced the possibility of criminal charges if the missing funds were reported. Thomas had covered the loss. He sold a section of timber rights, withdrew retirement savings, and paid the company account back before anyone outside the family discovered what had happened. Margaret wrote that Thomas had done it to protect Derek's future and preserve the family name. Thomas lowered the letter. "I thought he had learned from it." Clara watched him carefully. Margaret did not. The next page confirmed her concern. Margaret believed Derek had mistaken rescue for permission. He had apologized, but he had never accepted the full weight of what he had done. Thomas's mercy had prevented consequences, and without consequences, the lesson had faded. "She wrote that?" Thomas asked quietly, almost to himself. Clara nodded toward the page. "She wrote what she believed." Thomas read on. Margaret had become increasingly worried that Derek might one day return to Moore Ridge in financial trouble and pressure his father into selling. She did not believe he was evil. She believed he was weak when frightened and dangerous when shame threatened to expose him. That sentence struck Thomas harder than the rest. Joseph had seen similar patterns during his years in law enforcement. Some people caused harm because they enjoyed power. Others caused harm because they were desperate to escape the consequences of earlier choices. The damage to the victim was the same. The final section of Margaret's letter described a legal safeguard. Before her death, she had worked with an attorney named Arthur Bell. Arthur was 71, a retired estate lawyer who had spent more than 40 years creating trusts for ranching families across southern Idaho. Margaret wrote that he had helped her establish a protective community trust for Moore Ridge. The terms were strict. If Thomas were pressured into transferring the property, or if anyone attempted to declare him legally incapable through false or manipulated evidence, the ranch would automatically pass into the trust for 25 years. During that period, Moore Ridge could not be sold, divided, mortgaged, or used as collateral. The land would remain a working ranch, and part of its income would support local agricultural training and emergency assistance for struggling families. Joseph read the smaller legal sheet. It contained Arthur Bell's signature, several filing references, and a note confirming that the trust had been prepared. "This could stop the sale," he said. "It could stop more than that," Clara replied. "It could make the land untouchable." Thomas looked back at Margaret's letter. "Where is the original?" Clara's silence answered before she spoke. "I don't know." The smaller sheet was only a summary. The trust required an original signed copy and proof that it had been properly executed. Margaret's letter stated that she had placed the original somewhere safe at Moore Ridge, but she had intentionally avoided naming the location. Thomas searched his memory. She never told me. She may have believed that was the safest choice, Joseph said. Thomas leaned back in the chair. Or she believed I would forgive Derek again and hand it to him. No one corrected him. During the afternoon, Joseph searched the study, Margaret's old desk, and the locked cabinet where family deeds were stored. Clara examined boxes of correspondence in the upstairs bedroom. Thomas directed them toward several places Margaret once used for important documents. Nothing appeared. Ranger moved through the house with them, restless in a way Joseph recognized. The dog repeatedly returned to the mudroom door and looked toward the old horse stable east of the house. At first, Joseph assumed Ranger wanted to go outside. When he opened the door, Ranger crossed the yard without stopping. The stable had not been used regularly since Margaret's death. Its paint had faded, and one half of the roof had been repaired after a windstorm. Inside, old saddles hung from wooden pegs, and empty stalls carried the dry smell of hay and leather. Ranger walked directly to the last stall. A small brass plate remained fixed to the gate. Pearl. Pearl had been Margaret's white mare, a gentle horse she had raised from a foal and ridden until illness made it impossible. Thomas had buried the mare near the eastern pasture 2 years after Margaret died. Ranger sniffed along the stall wall, then moved to the old feeding trough. He circled it twice before sitting down. Joseph examined the floorboards and the lower wall. Nothing looked disturbed, but the dog refused to leave. "You found something?" Thomas called from the entrance. Joseph looked over his shoulder. Thomas had followed with Noah supporting one arm. "Maybe." Noah helped Thomas sit on an overturned feed barrel. The boy seemed unusually quiet. "You should be at school," Thomas said. Noah looked at the ground. "I left early." "Why?" "My grandmother had another medical bill. I need more hours here." Thomas studied him. "More hours for how long?" Noah hesitated. "I may not go back after this week." Joseph stopped examining the trough. Thomas's voice remained calm. "You are 16. I can work full-time. The ranch needs help, and my grandmother needs the money. The ranch will manage." "She won't." Noah tried to make the decision sound practical, but his eyes revealed what his words did not. He was afraid of failing the only family he had. Thomas looked toward Joseph. Years earlier, Joseph had worn the same expression when he learned that police academy tuition was beyond his reach. He had spoken about taking warehouse work instead, pretending he had never wanted the badge badly enough to grieve its loss. Thomas had recognized the lie then. He recognized it now. "You are not leaving school," Thomas said. Noah shook his head. "Mr. Moore, I can't ask you for help. Not with everything happening here. You did not ask. I know what people owe." Thomas's expression softened. "That is where you are wrong. Help is not always a debt." Noah said nothing. "When Joseph needed tuition, I paid it because someone had once given me a chance when I was young. I never asked him to repay me." Joseph glanced toward the hidden files inside the farmhouse. "He found his own way to do that." Thomas looked back at Noah. "You will stay in school. We will work out the bills, the hours, and whatever else is needed." "But the ranch might be taken." "Then I will help you before it is." The answer silenced everyone. Thomas had just learned that his son had betrayed him again, that his land was in danger, and that the legal protection his wife created might be lost. Yet his first instinct was still to protect a boy standing at the edge of his future. Clara, who had joined them near the stable door, looked down at Margaret's letter. "She was afraid your kindness would be used against you," she said. Thomas watched Noah. "That does not mean kindness was the mistake." Ranger rose and placed one paw against the base of Pearl's old feeding trough. The wood gave a faint, hollow sound. Joseph crouched beside it. The trough had been bolted to the wall for decades, but one iron bracket looked newer than the others. Behind it, a narrow seam ran along the floorboard. Joseph pressed his hand against the wood. Something beneath it shifted. He looked at Thomas. Margaret may have left us more than a letter." Thomas stared at Pearl's empty stall, while winter light entered through the dusty windows. For the first time that day, hope appeared beside the grief. It was small and uncertain, but it was there. Joseph knelt beside Pearl's old feeding trough while Ranger kept one paw pressed against the loose board. Dust covered the stable floor, and the winter light coming through the narrow windows made the air look pale and still. Thomas remained seated nearby, watching with the expression of a man who is afraid to hope too much. Joseph removed the newer iron bracket first. The screws resisted, but the wood around them had weakened with age. When the bracket came free, a narrow section of flooring lifted slightly beneath his fingers. "There is something under here," he said. Noah moved closer, but Clara held him back until Joseph had checked the edges. The board came away with a low scrape. Beneath it was a shallow space between the floor supports, carefully lined with old canvas to protect whatever had been hidden there. A small steel box rested inside. Thomas stared at it for several seconds. That belonged to Margaret. He recognized the faded blue paint and the dent near one corner. Years earlier, Margaret had used the box to store foaling records, vaccination papers, and handwritten notes about the horses. Thomas had assumed it was lost after she became ill. Joseph lifted the box from the floor and set it on the old workbench. The lock was small, but rusted. Clara searched through a drawer near the stable office and found a ring of old keys hanging beneath a shelf. The third key opened it. Inside lay a thick leather folder, 2 cloth-bound journals, and a portable tape recorder wrapped in a wool scarf. Everything had been sealed inside plastic bags. Thomas touched the scarf gently. She wore this every winter. Clara looked away, giving him a moment. Joseph opened the leather folder first. The document inside carried the seal of Arthur Bell's former law office and the signatures of Margaret, Thomas, and 2 witnesses. It was the original trust. Each page matched the summary Clara had found, but the full document contained additional details. If Thomas were pressured into transferring the ranch, or if any person attempted to gain guardianship through altered medical evidence, the trust would activate immediately. Moore Ridge would then remain protected for 25 years. It could not be sold, divided, mortgaged, leased to a development company, or used to settle private debt. Arthur Bell's filing notes confirmed that the trust had been legally executed. Joseph read the final page twice before turning to Thomas. This is valid protection, assuming the filing records still exist. Thomas lowered his head. For the first time since leaving the hospital, some of the tension left his shoulders. "Margaret saved the ranch," Noah said. Thomas looked at the box. "She tried to save all of us." The journals revealed why. Margaret had written regularly during the final years of her life. The earlier pages described ordinary matters, including feed costs, repairs, and the health of the horses. Later entries became more personal. Derek had approached his parents several times about selling part of the western pasture. At first, he claimed the land was no longer productive. Later, he spoke of development opportunities, rising property values, and the burden of managing such a large ranch. Margaret believed he needed money. One entry described a dinner during which Derek placed a preliminary contract beside Thomas's plate and urged him to sign before reading the full terms. Thomas had refused, but he had later told Margaret that Derek was only trying to help. Another entry recorded a telephone call Margaret overheard between Derek and an unknown investor. Derek promised that his father would eventually agree. Thomas closed the journal. "I kept explaining him to her," he said. "Every time she warned me, I found a reason not to believe the worst." "That is what parents often do," Clara replied. "They remember the child longer than the child remembers himself." The tape recorder still held a cassette. Joseph replaced the old batteries with fresh ones from the farmhouse and pressed the play button. For a few seconds, only static filled the stable. Then Margaret's voice entered the room. It was older and weaker than Thomas remembered, but unmistakably hers. If this recording is being played, then the written protections were needed. Thomas closed his eyes. Margaret explained that Derek had pressured them repeatedly to sell more ridge. Each time, he presented the sale as a family solution. He spoke of retirement, comfort, and security. Yet every proposal required Thomas to surrender control before receiving full details. She believed Derek's financial problems were deeper than he admitted. Her voice paused before continuing. Moore Ridge was never meant to become a monument to one family. Thomas and I received help when we were young, and we agreed that this land should someday return that kindness. The recording described plans they had discussed for years. A portion of the ranch income would provide scholarships for children from poor rural families. Another part would support ranchers facing bankruptcy after illness, drought, or disaster. The old bunkhouse would eventually become temporary housing for people rebuilding their lives. Noah stood motionless as he listened. Thomas looked at him once, then back at the recorder. Margaret ended with a final request. Do not protect the land only because it carries our name. Protect it because someone who has lost everything may one day need a place to begin again. The tape clicked off. No one spoke for nearly a minute. Joseph gathered the documents and carried them to the farmhouse where he photographed every page and placed the originals inside a locked fireproof cabinet. Then he made 2 telephone calls from the study. The first was to Evelyn Shaw, a 52-year-old county prosecutor known for handling financial fraud and property crimes across 3 rural districts. She listened without interruption while Joseph summarized the altered medical reports, the hidden debt records, and the original trust. This is no longer a family disagreement, Evelyn said. It may be attempted elder exploitation, document fraud, and conspiracy to obtain property. The second call went to Daniel Ruiz, a 48-year-old investigator assigned to the state's Vulnerable Adult Protection Unit. Daniel had spent nearly 20 years examining cases in which older people were isolated, pressured, or deprived of control over their finances. He asked Joseph not to confront Derek. Secure copies. Preserve every document exactly as found. Do not let him know how much you have. Joseph looked through the study window toward the northern barn. I think he already knows I'm looking. Then assume he may try to move faster. By the following afternoon, the first rumors reached Moore Ridge. A ranch supply clerk told Noah that Derek had been asking people whether they trusted an outsider who suddenly appeared after years away. At the diner, Melissa told 2 acquaintances that Joseph was influencing Thomas while he was weak and medicated. By evening, the story had grown. Joseph was no longer helping Thomas. He was trying to gain control of the ranch. Thomas heard the rumor from an old neighbor. He is building a defense before anyone accuses him, Joseph said. He is making me look helpless, Thomas replied. That is part of the same plan. Noah left the ranch shortly before dark to deliver groceries to his grandmother. The road near the eastern fence was quiet, bordered by frozen grass and bare cottonwood trees. A dark sedan pulled onto the shoulder ahead of him. 2 men stepped out. The first was in his mid-40s and wore a work jacket over a pressed shirt. The second was younger, perhaps 35, with heavy boots and the posture of someone accustomed to being used as intimidation. Noah stopped. We only want to talk, the older man said. Noah's hands tightened around the grocery bag. You were near the barn the other night. I work there. You may have seen a truck. Noah said nothing. The younger man stepped closer. Some things are better forgotten. My grandmother is waiting for me. Then go home and take care of her. Do not make trouble for people who can make life difficult. A sound came from behind Noah. Not a bark. A low, controlled growl. Ranger moved out from the trees and placed himself between Noah and the men. Joseph had sent the dog with him after noticing how nervous Noah seemed that afternoon. Ranger stood still, his body balanced and his eyes fixed on the strangers. The younger man stopped. The older one raised both hands. Control your dog. Noah's voice was quiet but steady. He is controlled. Ranger did not move toward them. He did not need to. His silence carried more warning than noise would have. The men returned to the sedan. Before getting inside, the older one looked at Noah. Think carefully. Noah watched until the car disappeared around the curve. Ranger turned toward him and touched his leg with one shoulder. The boy knelt and placed a hand against the dog's neck. For the first time, fear did not make him feel small. It made him understand that he was no longer facing it alone. When Noah returned to Moore Ridge and told Joseph what had happened, Joseph immediately called Evelyn and Daniel. The investigation was no longer waiting to begin. It had already reached the road outside Thomas's home. The wind began rising after sunset, sweeping across Moore Ridge in long, restless gusts that rattled the barn doors and bent the dry grass along the eastern fence. By 10 o'clock, the temperature had dropped sharply, and the farmhouse windows trembled whenever the strongest gusts crossed the open land. Thomas had gone to bed early. His ribs were healing, but even small movements still caused pain, and Joseph had insisted that he rest. Noah remained in the bunkroom near the kitchen because the roads were becoming difficult, while Ranger slept beside the back door with his head on his paws. The house had been quiet for nearly an hour when Ranger suddenly lifted his head. He did not bark. He stood, drew in a deep breath, and moved toward the kitchen window. Joseph was seated at the dining table reviewing copies of the trust documents. He noticed the change in the dog before he noticed anything else. "What is it?" Ranger pressed his nose near the lower edge of the door. His ears rose, and a low sound formed in his throat. Then Joseph smelled it. Smoke. He crossed the room and looked outside. At first, the darkness seemed unchanged. Then a thin orange light appeared beyond the horse paddock. The northern field was burning. Joseph was on his feet before the thought fully formed. "Noah, wake up." The boy came from the bunkroom in socks and a flannel shirt. "What happened?" "Fire. Get your boots and call the volunteer station." Ranger had already turned away from the door. Instead of running toward the flames, he moved down the hallway and stopped outside Thomas's room. Joseph followed. Thomas was trying to sit up when Joseph entered. "I heard something." "The field is on fire." Thomas reached for the chair beside the bed. "You are not walking out there alone," Joseph said. "I know my own house. And I know smoke moves faster than pride." Joseph helped him into a heavy coat and guided him through the kitchen. Ranger remained close to Thomas's injured side, matching the old man's slow pace. Outside, the wind carried sparks across the frozen ground. The fire had started near the northern barn and was moving toward the old stable where Pearl's stall stood. Dry hay, wooden fencing, and years of winter grass created a path that could carry the flames across the entire property. Noah was already dragging a hose from the side of the house. "The water line is frozen near the pump," he shouted. Joseph ran to the equipment shed and found 2 long fire hoses used during harvest season. The main ranch well still had pressure, but the nearest outdoor connection had iced over. He opened a line closer to the farmhouse and began pulling the hose across the yard. The first neighbor arrived within minutes. Caleb Turner was 61, a cattle rancher who owned the property west of Moore Ridge and had known Thomas for more than 30 years. He came in an old pickup carrying shovels, blankets, and 2 portable water tanks. Behind him came Linda and Mark Hayes, a retired schoolteacher and her 59-year-old husband, who operated a small feed store in Willow Creek. They had seen the glow from the county road and turned toward the ranch without waiting to be called. No one asked who had started the fire. There was no time. Joseph directed Caleb toward the northern fence where the flames were spreading through the grass. Noah and Mark opened the gate near the stable and began moving the horses into the southern pasture. Thomas stood beside the porch, pale with pain and frustration. "You should be farther from the smoke," Joseph called, "and you should stop telling me things I already know." Despite the answer, Thomas allowed Linda to guide him toward Caleb's truck, where the air was clearer. The fire reached the side of the northern barn shortly after 11. Flames climbed the outer wall, feeding on old paint and dry timber. Joseph and Caleb aimed water at the roof while the wind pushed smoke into their faces. The building held no original evidence now. Joseph had moved everything important into the farmhouse and secured copies elsewhere. Whoever started the fire may not have known that, or they may have been trying to destroy any trace of the hidden compartment. A sharp crack came from the barn roof. "Back!" Joseph shouted. Part of the upper frame collapsed inward, sending sparks high into the wind. The men retreated as burning boards fell through the loft. Ranger moved along the outer edge of the fire, keeping low. Joseph called him back twice, but the dog had found a scent and refused to leave it. He stopped near the rear wall, several yards from the flames, and scratched at the frozen ground. Joseph reached him and saw a dark work glove partly buried beneath loose snow. The cloth was wet, not with water. Joseph lifted it carefully, using a clean rag from his pocket. A strong gasoline odor rose from the material. "This did not come from an electrical fire," Caleb said. Joseph placed the glove inside an empty feed bag to preserve it. Ranger lowered his nose again and followed a scent trail away from the barn. It crossed the northern field, passed through a break in the fence, and continued toward an unused service road. Joseph followed with a flashlight. Tire tracks cut through the snow beyond the gate. Near the road, the scent ended beside a set of impressions where a vehicle had been parked. One tread pattern was deep and uneven. Joseph recognized it. It matched the tires on the silver car Noah had described near the barn weeks earlier. By midnight, the Willow Creek Volunteer Fire Department arrived with 2 engines. The firefighters contained the northern field and saved most of the old stable. The barn roof was damaged beyond repair, but the fire never reached the farmhouse or the southern pasture. As the flames weakened, Derek's SUV appeared at the end of the driveway. He stepped out wearing a heavy coat and an expression of alarm. Melissa remained in the passenger seat. "What happened?" Derek called as he approached. "I saw the fire from the highway." Thomas watched him from beside Caleb's truck. Joseph said nothing. Derek looked toward the burned barn. "That wiring was old. I told Dad years ago it needed replacing." Caleb turned his head slowly. The fire chief, Walter Dean, was 54 and had served the volunteer department for more than 2 decades. He had just finished examining the first burn pattern near the rear of the barn. "We have not identified the cause," Walter said. Derek shook his head. "It has to be electrical. This is exactly why he should not be managing the property alone." Thomas straightened despite the pain in his ribs. Melissa stepped out of the vehicle. "No one is blaming you, Thomas. Accidents happen." Thomas looked at her, then at his son. For months, he had tolerated their explanations. He had allowed them to finish his sentences, answer his doctors, and describe his memory as though he were not present. Even after finding the documents, part of him had continued searching for a reason to believe Derek had not crossed every line. That part was gone now. "The fire started behind the barn," Joseph said. "We found a glove carrying the smell of gasoline." Derek's face changed, but only slightly. "That proves nothing." "No one said it did." "You are turning every problem into an accusation." Joseph held his gaze. "I am preserving evidence." Derek looked toward the damaged building. "This ranch is falling apart because Dad refuses to accept reality." Thomas stepped away from the truck. Linda tried to steady him, but he gently raised one hand. He walked only a few paces before stopping in front of Derek. The wind moved smoke between them, carrying the last sparks into the dark field. "You think I do not understand what is happening," Thomas said. Derek lowered his voice. "You are injured. You are frightened. Joseph is filling your head with ideas." Thomas's expression remained calm. "You took my phone. You controlled my accounts. You prepared papers to take away my rights. Now, a barn burns after your plan is discovered. Dad, listen to yourself." "I am listening." Derek glanced at the neighbors standing nearby. "This is not the place. It became the place when you brought it to my home." For a moment, Derek looked like the boy Thomas remembered, not innocent, but cornered. The old instinct to protect him stirred once and then fell silent. Thomas met his son's eyes. "I may be old, but I've never been blind." No one spoke. The sentence did not sound loud, yet it crossed the yard more clearly than the wind. Derek looked toward Joseph, then at the firefighters, the neighbors, and the ruined barn. Something in his posture changed. The confidence he had carried into hospitals, meetings, and family conversations was no longer holding. Thomas had finally spoken in front of witnesses. The story of a confused old man could no longer remain unchallenged. Derek turned toward Melissa. "We should go." Before they reached the vehicle, Joseph noticed soot on the lower edge of Melissa's coat. It was not enough to prove anything. Not yet. The stronger evidence arrived the next morning. Daniel Ruiz called from the county office. Investigators had reviewed security footage from a gas station 8 miles outside Willow Creek. The recording showed Melissa purchasing 4 red fuel containers on the afternoon before the fire. Another camera captured the silver car entering the Northern Service Road after dark. The vehicle was registered to the man Noah had seen meeting Melissa in the barn. Joseph stood in the damaged field as he listened. Behind him, Thomas watched firefighters remove the last smoking boards. Ranger sat beside the old man, his body still and protective. The fire had destroyed part of the ranch. It had also burned away the final cover protecting Derek and Melissa. For the first time, their plan was no longer hidden behind concern, paperwork, and polite explanations. It had left tracks in the snow. The emergency guardianship hearing began 3 weeks after the fire, on a cold morning at the county courthouse in Willow Creek. Snow still covered the courthouse steps, and the hallways carried the quiet tension of a place where private pain was about to become public record. Derek and Melissa had filed the petition 2 days after investigators began examining the fire. Their argument was simple. Thomas was elderly, injured, emotionally unstable, and under the influence of Joseph, a police officer who had suddenly returned after years away. According to their petition, Joseph was manipulating Thomas in order to gain control of Moore Ridge. The claim angered Joseph, but he did not allow the anger to guide him. He entered the courtroom carrying a slim evidence folder and sat beside Thomas. Ranger waited outside with a courthouse security officer because animals were not permitted inside the hearing room. Thomas looked tired but steady. His ribs had begun to heal, though every deep breath still reminded him of the fall. At the front of the room sat Judge Eleanor Price, a 63-year-old county judge who had spent more than 30 years handling family, property, and guardianship cases. She was known for listening carefully and disliking emotional performances that were not supported by facts. Derek sat across the aisle beside Melissa and their attorney, Charles Vance. Charles was 56, a private lawyer from Boise whose practice focused on estate disputes and corporate property transfers. He spoke with confidence and treated the hearing as though the outcome had already been decided. Charles began by presenting the medical reports. He described Thomas as a man in decline, someone who forgot important information, made unsafe decisions, and resisted reasonable care. He referred to the fall, the earlier hospital visits, and the fire at Moore Ridge. "The petitioners are not seeking to punish Mr. Moore," Charles said. "They are trying to protect him from further harm." Thomas watched his son while the words filled the courtroom. Derek kept his eyes lowered. Charles then turned toward Joseph. He suggested that Joseph had arrived during a vulnerable moment, isolated Thomas from his family, and encouraged him to distrust the people closest to him. He also implied that Joseph expected a future role in managing the ranch. Judge Price looked at Joseph. "Do you have a financial interest in Moore Ridge?" "No, Your Honor." "Have you been promised land, money, or any position connected to the property?" "No." Charles rose again. "Yet you participated in searching private buildings and removing documents." "I preserved evidence Thomas authorized me to examine." "You are not assigned to this county." "That is correct." "Then why involve yourself?" Joseph answered without raising his voice. "Because Thomas asked for help, and the evidence indicated possible exploitation." The courtroom remained silent. Evelyn Shaw stood to present the response. She explained that she was not appearing to decide criminal guilt during a guardianship hearing. She was appearing because the petition relied on documents that had become part of an active investigation. She placed the original medical reports beside the altered copies submitted by Derek and Melissa. One version stated that Thomas remained alert, oriented, and capable of understanding decisions. The altered version replaced that language with descriptions of confusion, poor judgment, and cognitive decline. Judge Price examined the pages for several minutes. "Who provided these altered copies?" she asked. Charles turned toward Derek. Derek shifted in his chair. "They came from records Melissa handled." Melissa looked at him sharply. Judge Price's expression did not change. "That was not my question." Evelyn moved to the financial evidence. Bank notices and loan agreements showed that Derek faced severe debt from failed development projects. Draft contracts revealed that the proposed sale of Moore Ridge would satisfy those debts while leaving little money for Thomas. The handwritten notes were even more damaging. On one page, Derek had calculated the estimated sale price, then subtracted his private obligations. Thomas's future appeared nowhere in those calculations. Charles argued that financial trouble did not prove exploitation. Evelyn agreed. Then she presented the trust. The original document carried legal signatures, witness statements, filing references, and the conditions Margaret and Thomas had established years earlier. If Thomas were pressured to transfer the ranch, or if false evidence were used to obtain guardianship, Moore Ridge would enter protected trust control for 25 years. Charles objected that the trust had been hidden and might not reflect Thomas's present wishes. Judge Price looked directly at Thomas. "Do you understand what this trust does?" "Yes." "Do you support its activation?" Thomas looked across the room at Derek. "I do." Clara testified next. She confirmed Margaret's handwriting on the envelope, the letter, and the journals. She also confirmed the voice on the tape recording. She had known Margaret for more than 40 years and had spoken with her almost every week during the final months of her life. Evelyn played a short section of the recording. Margaret's voice filled the courtroom, quiet but clear. She spoke of repeated pressure from Derek, her concern for Thomas, and the purpose of Moore Ridge. The ranch was meant to support more than one family. It was meant to create second chances. Derek closed his eyes while the recording played. Helen Moore took the witness chair after Clara. She described Thomas's 3 hospital visits. One involved a bruised shoulder, another a sprained wrist and head injury, and the third the fall that cracked his ribs. Derek and Melissa had offered different explanations each time. "Did Thomas appear mentally incapable during those visits?" Evelyn asked. "No." "Did he appear afraid?" Helen paused. "He appeared quieter each time." Charles asked whether Thomas had ever directly accused Derek or Melissa of causing the injuries. "No," Helen answered. "Then you cannot say abuse occurred." "I can say silence is not proof that harm did not occur." The answer settled heavily over the room. Noah was called last. He walked toward the witness chair with his shoulders tight and his hands held close to his sides. Thomas gave him a small nod before he sat down. Noah described seeing Melissa inside the northern barn with a man in a dark suit. He explained that she had spoken about Thomas signing papers once medical documents were ready. He also described the truck that left the ranch and the 2 men who later stopped him on the road. Charles approached carefully. "You are 16, correct?" "Yes." "You depend on Thomas for employment." "Yes." "And Thomas recently offered to help with your schooling." Noah swallowed. "Yes." "So you have a reason to support his version of events." Noah looked toward Thomas, then back at Charles. "I had a reason to stay quiet, too." The lawyer paused. "I was afraid they would hurt my grandmother or make me lose my job," Noah continued. "But being afraid did not change what I saw." Joseph felt something in his chest loosen. Noah had found his courage without losing his fear. The final evidence concerned the fire. Daniel Ruiz summarized the gasoline-stained glove, the vehicle tracks, the gas station footage showing Melissa purchasing fuel containers, and the camera recording of the silver car entering the Northern Service Road. Charles insisted none of it directly showed Melissa setting the fire. Evelyn did not argue otherwise. She simply reminded the court that the guardianship petition had been filed while evidence of fraud, intimidation, and attempted destruction remained under active investigation. Judge Price called a brief recess. When the hearing resumed, Thomas asked to speak. He stood slowly. Joseph moved to help him, but Thomas raised one hand and balanced himself against the table. He faced the judge first. "I understand my age. I understand my injuries. I understand that I may need help for things I once did alone." Then he turned toward Derek. "I also understand my own son." Derek finally looked at him. Thomas's voice did not rise. "I love you. That has never changed. I loved you when you were 8 years old and afraid of thunderstorms. I loved you when you made your first serious mistake. I loved you when I paid debts you should have faced yourself." Derek's face tightened. "But love does not mean surrendering my name, my choices, or my dignity. It does not mean allowing you to decide that my life belongs to you because I have grown old." No one moved. "I can forgive weakness," Thomas continued. "I cannot call control kindness. I cannot call deception protection." He looked toward Melissa. "And I will not sign away Moore Ridge to rescue people who are willing to destroy me in order to save themselves." Thomas sat down. Judge Price delivered her ruling 20 minutes later. The emergency guardianship petition was denied. The court found no credible evidence that Thomas lacked the capacity to manage his personal or legal affairs. The altered medical records raised serious concerns, and the evidence suggested that the petition itself may have been connected to financial exploitation. The trust was recognized and activated. Moore Ridge entered legal protection for 25 years. No sale, mortgage, division, or transfer could proceed. Judge Price also issued a protective order preventing Derek and Melissa from contacting Thomas outside approved legal channels. As the hearing ended, 2 county investigators approached the opposite table. Derek and Melissa were taken into custody for questioning and formal investigation related to fraud, falsified documents, elder exploitation, intimidation, and suspected arson. There was no shouting. Derek did not resist. Before leaving, he looked at Thomas. For one brief moment, the careful businessman disappeared, and Thomas saw the frightened boy he had raised. That was the hardest part. Outside the courthouse, Noah stood beside Ranger while Clara and Helen spoke quietly near the steps. Joseph guided Thomas into the cold sunlight. People around them believed the old man had won. Thomas did not feel victorious. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. The ranch was safe. His rights had been restored. The truth had been heard. Yet the person who had tried to take everything from him was still his son. Some victories saved the future while leaving the heart to grieve what could not be restored. Ranger moved close and rested his head beneath Thomas's hand. Thomas opened his eyes. He had lost an illusion that day, but he had not lost everything. He still had his home, his voice, and the people who had chosen to stand beside him when silence would have been easier. 1 year later, late summer sunlight stretched across Moore Ridge, turning the fields gold and warming the repaired fences that once stood blackened by fire. The ranch no longer felt like a place waiting for another threat. It felt alive again. The northern barn had been rebuilt with stronger timber and a wider entrance. The old stable near Pearl's stall had been preserved, including the feeding trough where Ranger had discovered Margaret's hidden box. Thomas refused to replace it. "Some old things have earned the right to stay," he often said. Under the protection of the trust, Moore Ridge could not be sold or divided. More importantly, the land had begun serving the purpose Margaret had imagined years earlier. A section of the ranch now operated as the Moore Ridge Agricultural Learning Center. The program offered practical training to teenagers from families facing financial hardship. They learned how to care for livestock, repair fences, manage irrigation, maintain equipment, and understand the responsibility that came with working the land. Thomas had expected 5 students during the first season. 12 arrived. Some came from farms damaged by debt or drought. Others came from homes where money was always short and hope had become difficult to discuss. Thomas did not ask them to explain every hardship. He gave them work, instruction, and a place at the long dining table inside the restored bunkhouse. He had once done the same for Joseph. Now he understood that kindness could travel through generations when someone gave it room to continue. Noah became the first official scholarship recipient of the trust. He remained in high school and worked at Moore Ridge on weekends, but his responsibilities changed. Instead of carrying every burden alone, he began helping younger students learn the tasks Thomas had once taught him. He had also chosen a future. Noah wanted to become a veterinarian. The idea had grown during the months after the hearing, when he helped care for 2 neglected horses brought to the ranch by a rescue group. One had an injured leg. The other had grown afraid of human touch after years of poor treatment. Noah spent weeks sitting quietly near them without asking for trust too quickly. Thomas watched the boy one morning as the frightened mare finally accepted an apple from his hand. "You are patient with broken things," Thomas said. Noah looked toward the horse. "They are not broken. They just remember what happened." Thomas understood that answer better than the boy realized. The scholarship covered Noah's school expenses and placed additional money into an education fund for college. His grandmother's medical bills were also being managed through a local assistance program connected to the trust. Noah no longer spoke about leaving school. He spoke about applications, science classes, and the kind of clinic he hoped to open someday for elderly farm animals and abandoned dogs. Joseph became an honorary oversight member of the trust. The title required him to review major decisions, attend quarterly meetings, and make sure the ranch continued serving its original purpose. Thomas claimed the position existed because Joseph asked too many questions to be left unsupervised. Joseph replied that Thomas had ignored too much advice to be trusted alone. Their arguments became a familiar source of entertainment during meetings. Joseph still worked as a police officer more than 200 miles away, but he returned to Moore Ridge whenever his schedule allowed. Sometimes he came for official trust business. More often he arrived with no reason beyond checking the fences and making sure Thomas was taking his medication. Ranger always came with him. The German Shepherd had developed a quiet routine with Thomas. Each morning, Ranger waited beside the porch until the old man appeared with coffee. He followed Thomas to the stable, inspected every student as if conducting his own private training program, and rested beneath the cottonwood tree during the hottest part of the afternoon. Ranger had become older during the year. A little gray now showed near his muzzle, and he rose more slowly after long naps. His attention remained sharp. Whenever a vehicle entered the ranch, Ranger noticed before anyone else. Whenever Thomas moved too close to uneven ground, the dog appeared beside him. Thomas sometimes complained that Joseph had assigned him a 4-legged supervisor. He never asked Ranger to leave. The legal case against Derek and Melissa ended months after the hearing. Both accepted agreements that required them to admit responsibility for financial fraud, falsified records, elder exploitation, and involvement connected to the fire. Melissa received a longer sentence because investigators proved that she had purchased the fuel and coordinated with the 2 men who intimidated Noah. Derek accepted a reduced sentence after cooperating with the investigation and admitting that he had planned to use the ranch sale to escape his debts. The news brought no satisfaction to Thomas. He had wanted the truth recognized. He had wanted the ranch protected. He had never wanted to see his son behind prison walls. One afternoon, a letter arrived bearing Derek's name. Thomas carried it into the study and left it unopened on Margaret's old desk for 3 days. When he finally read it, Joseph was not there. Clara was not there. No one could help him decide how to feel. Derek did not ask for money. He did not ask for the ranch. He wrote that prison had given him too much time to remember the choices he had avoided facing. He admitted that he had blamed Thomas, Margaret, Joseph, the banks, and the economy, because blaming others was easier than accepting what fear and pride had turned him into. Near the end, he mentioned the western fence. Derek had helped Thomas build it when he was 14 years old. They had worked for 3 summer days, arguing about the distance between the posts and laughing when a young horse stole Derek's hat. The fence still stood, though several sections leaned after years of hard winters. Derek wrote only one request. When his sentence ended, he hoped Thomas might allow him to return for one day and repair that fence beside him. He did not ask to be forgiven. He asked for a chance to begin with one honest piece of work. Thomas read the letter twice. Then he folded it and placed it in the same drawer where he had once kept Joseph's first police badge. He did not write back. He did not throw it away. Some doors did not need to be opened immediately to remain unlocked. Near the end of August, Moore Ridge held its first community open day. Families from Willow Creek toured the barns, watched students demonstrate horse care, and shared a meal beneath the long canvas tents near the southern field. Noah led a group of children toward the pasture. He explained how to approach a horse calmly and why trust could not be forced. One little girl asked whether the oldest horse on the ranch was useless. Noah smiled. Old does not mean useless. Sometimes it means experienced enough to teach everyone else. Thomas heard the answer from the porch and looked pleased. As the visitors began leaving, the evening became quiet. Joseph sat beside Thomas in an old wooden chair while Ranger stretched across the porch boards between them. The dog's tail tapped once whenever Noah's voice carried from the stable. Thomas watched the students closing gates and putting away tools. "A year ago, I thought I was about to lose this place," he said. Joseph looked across the fields. "You almost did. I thought the land was the most important thing. And now?" Thomas considered the question. "The land matters because of what it allows people to become." Beyond the fence, Noah was helping a younger boy lift a feed bucket without spilling it. The boy laughed when the grain nearly tipped over. Noah laughed with him instead of becoming impatient. Thomas smiled. "When I paid your academy tuition, I thought I was helping one poor young man earn a badge." Joseph turned toward him. "I did not know I was helping create the man who would return when I could no longer protect myself." Joseph was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. "You did not just pay for my education. You gave me a reason to become a good man." Thomas looked toward him. "You did the difficult part yourself." "Maybe. But someone had to show me the road." The sun lowered behind the western hills, covering Moore Ridge in soft amber light. The rebuilt barn cast a long shadow across the field. The fences were not perfect. Neither were the people who had repaired them. That no longer seemed like failure. Moore Ridge had once been the inheritance of a single family. Now it had become a place where young people found direction, struggling families found support, and wounded animals learned to trust again. It was also a place where forgiveness remained possible without pretending that harm had never occurred. Thomas rested one hand on Ranger's head. The old dog closed his eyes beneath the gentle touch. Around them, the ranch settled into evening. Gates clicked shut. Horses moved quietly through the pasture. Laughter drifted from the bunkhouse where the students were finishing dinner. Thomas had once feared that asking for help would make him weak. Instead, that single phone call had protected his home, restored his voice, and opened the land to people who needed the same kindness he had once given Joseph. The ranch was no longer only a legacy from the past. It had become a promise to the future. And as the last light faded across Moore Ridge, Ranger remained beside the old man, quietly watching over a home built not only from timber, fences, and earth, but from loyalty, courage, and second chances. This story reminds us that kindness is never wasted. Years ago, Thomas Moore helped a poor young man enter the police academy without asking for anything in return. Decades later, Joseph Wilson returned when Thomas needed someone brave enough to stand beside him. Joseph did more than protect a ranch. He protected an old man's voice, dignity, and right to choose his own future. Ranger showed us that loyalty does not always need words. Noah taught us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what is right even while fear remains. Derek's choices leave us with another important lesson. Love can forgive, but love should never be used as an excuse to accept manipulation, dishonesty, or control. Sometimes the most loving thing a person can do is set a boundary, face the truth, and allow others to take responsibility for the choices they have made. In the end, Moore Ridge became more than a family ranch. It became a place where struggling young people found direction, wounded animals found care, and kindness was passed from one generation to the next. One generous act may seem small in the moment, but years later, it can return in ways no one could have imagined. What did you think about Thomas keeping Derek's letter instead of throwing it away? Do you believe Derek deserved another chance, or was his betrayal too painful to forgive? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We would truly love to hear what this story meant to you. If this story touched your heart, please give the video a like and share it with someone who believes in loyalty, forgiveness, and second chances. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another meaningful story about the extraordinary bond between people and animals. Thank you for watching, and may kindness always find its way back home.